"Hey, Callahan," Zane Thatcher sneered, his voice loud and cruel enough to slice through the murmur of the early morning market. "Selling weeds again, or just giving out pity baskets?" Wren tightened her grip on the handle of her wooden crate, but said nothing. Her jaw locked in place, her spine straightening with practiced silence. She didn't look at Zane or his two shadows trailing him like obedient dogs. She kept arranging the carrots on her table. Small, slightly crooked, but scrubbed clean and tied with twine. The sun hadn't quite cleared the ridge over Maple Hollow, and the frost still clung to the crates lining the gravel lot of the Saturday farmers' market. Wren had claimed her usual spot by the rusted feed store wall, between the busted soda machine and the stack of used pallets that reeked faintly of fertilizer. It wasn't pretty, but it was hers. Zane didn't stop. He never did. "Heard your grandma's coughing up her lungs again," he added, louder now. "Surprised she ain't dead already. What are you gonna do then, huh? Sell dead flowers and cry into your vegetables?" That one stung, sharper than the wind. Wren's fingers clenched around a bundle of kale, the veins on the leaves crinkling beneath her knuckles. Still, she didn't reply. That was the only power she had left, silence. Don't give him the satisfaction. Don't give them more to twist. They stayed long enough to knock over one of her crates and smear mud on the hand-painted sign, "Fresh from the Callahan Garden." Then they disappeared in a trail of laughter and sneaker scuffs, back into the circle of smirking vendors and indifferent adults who pretended not to see. Wren rebuilt her table slowly, gathering the fallen vegetables with frozen fingers. Her cheeks burned, not just from the wind but from shame, the kind that settled in bones and made her feel smaller than her 11 years. She didn't cry. Crying was for people who still believed someone would help. She packed the remaining produce into her wagon and took the long way home, through the side trail that curved behind the old Thatcher property, where the weeds grew thick and the trees swallowed sound. She should have seen it coming. Zane was waiting with his crew near the rusted barn behind the dog run his family once used for illegal breeding, and, some whispered, worse. The fence sagged under the weight of years and neglect, its chain links spotted with rust and streaked with old claw marks. "We got a surprise for you," Zane said, too sweetly. "Bet you miss having a pet. Thought we'd give you a chance." They flanked her, pushing her forward with a fake gentleness. Wren stumbled over a tree root, caught herself, and froze when the gate swung open. Inside the pen, a figure moved. Large, dark, low to the ground. A German shepherd, scarred and lean, with eyes that didn't blink and breath that steamed through bared teeth. "Meet Axel," Zane smirked. "He bites, enjoy." The gate slammed shut behind her. Wren stood still, heart slamming against her ribs. Axel growled, the sound deep and hollow, like something dredged from a pit too dark for light. He lunged once, the chain catching with a violent jolt that shook the entire pen. She didn't scream. She didn't run. She couldn't. Instead, she knelt, slowly, her knees pressing into the cold dirt, her fingers shaking as they reached inside her flannel shirt for the thin metal tag she wore every day around her neck. Her father's dog tag. Axel stopped. His body stiffened, ears twitching forward, the growl cut off like a switch had flipped. Wren didn't dare breathe. Her hand closed around the tag, and she lowered her eyes. No sudden moves. She whispered, barely audible, "It's okay. I'm not here to hurt you." A shift in the air. Axel lowered his head, slowly, deliberately, as if remembering something ancient. His paws stepped forward, silent and deliberate, and he stopped just inches from her knees. Then, with a sound so soft it barely broke the tension, he whined, a high, uncertain note of recognition. Wren lifted her eyes. The dog's gaze met hers. And then, as if pulled by some invisible thread, Axel lowered his massive head into her lap. Outside the cage, Zane and his friends stopped laughing. A phone dropped. No one moved. Wren lifted a trembling hand and touched Axel's fur, coarse and warm under her fingers. His body shivered once, then stilled. The growling didn't return. Only the sound of breathing. Heron, his, shared. The moment someone finally opened the gate, it was the town sheriff who stepped through, boots crunching over gravel. Sheriff Granger's voice was quiet. "Step back, Wren." She didn't move. She looked up at him, her other hand still clutching the dog tag. "He didn't hurt me." Granger took one long look at the way Axel leaned against her, at the stillness in the air and the shock on the boys' faces. Then he nodded, slowly, like a man seeing something he didn't quite believe. Someone had filmed the whole thing. The video would surface before sunset, gaining hundreds of views in hours. The caption would read, "The dog who chose to remember." But in that moment, none of that mattered. Only the weight of Axel's head and the warmth of his breath, and the sudden silent knowledge that something had shifted. Something had begun. The waiting room at Dr. Eliza Monroe's clinic smelled like antiseptic and hay. It was too quiet for this early in the morning, save for the clicking of a wall clock and the occasional shift of paws against tile. Wren sat hunched on a vinyl bench, her flannel sleeves damp with cold sweat, her fingers gripping the rusted military tag around her neck like it was oxygen. Axel sat beside her, not tethered, not caged, just there, still, watchful. His breath came in slow, even puffs, but his eyes never left the door to the exam room, where the vet and the sheriff had taken Helen Callahan minutes earlier. Sheriff Noah Granger stood leaning against the far wall, arms crossed, his wide-brimmed hat shadowing a gaze filled with things he wasn't yet ready to say. He'd driven them straight from the Thatchers' property to the clinic, siren off, but urgency blazing in his knuckles as they gripped the wheel. Wren hadn't spoken the entire way, and neither had he. There was something sacred in the silence, a child and a dog, and a town that had stopped holding its breath. The door creaked open. Dr. Monroe stepped out, her boots scuffed, her white coat worn at the elbows, and her stethoscope looped like a question around her neck. Her eyes found Wren's, and for a moment something old and cautious passed through them, then softened. "I need to see the tag," she said gently. Wren blinked, then slowly lifted the chain from around her neck and held it out like a priest offering sacrament. Eliza took it, turning it over in her gloved fingers. Her breath hitched. "This isn't just a tag," she murmured. "It's a match." She disappeared into the back, re-emerging with a dusty file from a locked cabinet. She flipped it open on the counter, revealing a grainy photo. A younger Axel, bulkier, cleaner, more alert, wearing a Kevlar vest, his eyes locked on the camera like he was waiting for orders. Next to him stood a man in desert camo, a grin crooked on his sunburned face. Matthew Callahan. Eliza tapped the paper clip to the photo. "This is the final directive filed before Sergeant Callahan was KIA in Helmand Province. It states, if he doesn't return, Axel is to be transferred directly to his next of kin. There's even a note here, handwritten. If Wren ever needs him, he'll find her." Her voice cracked. "I've never seen a handler request something like that." Granger exhaled slowly. "How'd the dog end up in the hands of the mayor's son?" "That," Eliza said, setting the file down like a relic, "is a question someone doesn't want answered." Wren looked up at Axel. He sat, still as stone, but his ears twitched when her voice broke through the fog. "Do you remember him?" she whispered. "My dad?" Axel shifted. His nose touched the tag in Eliza's palm, then dropped to Wren's lap. His eyes were heavy, old, carrying the weight of dust and war. When he exhaled, it was like he was breathing for the both of them. Eliza turned to Granger. This dog was declared unstable, dangerous, but look at him. Granger rubbed his jaw. You think someone faked the records? Maybe not faked, maybe exaggerated. It's easier to discard what's broken than to fix it. Behind them, Helen emerged from the exam room, her oxygen tank hissing softly. She looked older than Wren had ever seen her, but her voice still carried steel. Eliza, she said, stepping forward. That dog, that's Axel, the one Matthew never stopped talking about. The one he said wasn't just a partner, but a piece of his soul. Wren stood. Her legs trembled, not from fear, but from the enormity pressing down around her. This wasn't a stray dog anymore. This was her inheritance. I want to keep him, she said, voice raw. I don't care what they say. Granger shook his head slowly. It's not that simple. Mayor Thatcher's already making noise, saying this whole thing was staged. He's pushing for Axel to be impounded, possibly put down. Helen moved forward, standing between Wren and the law like a weathered shield. If that man tries to take away the last living thing my son ever loved, she said, he'll have to go through me. Eliza reached for her clipboard. Then we document everything. Medical scans, behavior evaluations, military ID, chain of command. I'll back you up. So will the records. Granger nodded. You've got my vote. But Wren... He looked her square in the eye. This won't be a quiet fight. Wren's fingers brushed Axel's fur, coarse and warm beneath her palm. The dog let out a low, contented sigh. Somewhere in that exhale was the sound of boots in sand, of letters written but never mailed, of a bond forged under fire and carried home in silence. I'm not afraid, she said. Eliza handed the tag back, and Wren slipped it over her head like armor. The weight of it no longer pulled her down. It held her upright. As they stepped out into the crisp Nebraska air, a woman with a camera stood across the street, lens focused, questions already forming. A headline was coming. Wren could feel it, but so was the war. When you're 11 years old, the world rarely knocks before it tries to break you. That morning, Wren Callahan sat at the edge of her grandmother's porch, sipping watered-down cocoa from a chipped mug, the sunrise still clinging to the Nebraska fields like it was reluctant to leave. Axel lay at her feet, unmoving except for the subtle twitch of one ear. The silence was full, of breath, of worry, of things unspoken. Then came the knock. 3 hard raps. Not angry, not rushed, just deliberate. It was the kind of knock that turned your stomach over before your mind even caught up. Helen opened the door slowly, already braced for something heavy, and Sheriff Noah Granger stood there, all boots and badge and weariness. He removed his hat. Helen, morning, is Wren around? Wren stood, Axel instantly at her side. She didn't speak. She didn't have to. Her eyes asked the question. Granger exhaled through his nose like the words he was about to say tasted bitter. Richard Thatcher filed a complaint, claims you trespassed on private property and endangered yourself and others by interacting with a classified war canine. There's going to be a public hearing tomorrow morning. Helen's voice came out thin and cold. A child saves a dog, and that's a crime now. The sheriff only shook his head. There's more. The footage. It's gone viral. The state's watching. So is the press. By afternoon, Maple Hollow was humming like a wire stretched too tight. The community center, usually reserved for quilting bees and farmers' meetings, had been turned into an impromptu courtroom. Rows of metal folding chairs creaked beneath the weight of anticipation. Reporters buzzed at the edges, whispering and ready. Wren sat near the front, flanked by Helen and Dr. Eliza Monroe. Axel was curled beside her, as motionless as ever, but his gaze never wandered. He kept his eyes forward, focused, present. Across the aisle, Richard Thatcher adjusted the cuffs of his tailored suit. Zane sat slouched beside him, not looking at anything, not even the cameras. His usual bravado had withered. Maybe guilt made poor armor. Judge Ruth Everly entered the room like a winter wind, composed, clear-eyed, and cutting through the noise with nothing but a glance. We are gathered to consider the complaint filed against Wren Callahan and determine the legal status of the animal named Axel. Weston Clark, Thatcher's lawyer, stood. His voice was smooth, like ice polished over stone. Your Honor, my client believes the dog is a risk to public safety. This child, unsupervised, was recorded in close proximity to a trained military animal once deemed unfit for civilian contact. We are asking for immediate removal and custody transfer to state authorities. There was a murmur, soft and brittle, from the back of the room. The townspeople shifted uncomfortably. They had seen the video. They had felt something stir beneath their ribs when Axel placed his head in Wren's lap. Then Rachel Boone stepped forward. She wasn't tall, wasn't loud, but the way she walked to the front told the room she didn't need to be. I'm a veterinarian with 30 years' experience. Axel isn't dangerous. He's traumatized. There's a difference. He didn't react to fear with violence. He reacted to Wren with memory. Judge Everly tilted her head. Do we have proof? A boy stood up in the back, tall, nervous, Asher Kemp. I filmed it, he said, holding up a small flash drive. Zane dared her. I didn't think she'd go in. I thought the dog would lose it. But he didn't. He changed, like something clicked inside him. The footage played. The room leaned forward, breath suspended. Axel snarling, pacing, then stopping. Sitting, lowering his head. Wren's small hand reaching out. Helen rose next. Her hands trembled as she passed a folded letter to the judge. My son wrote this before his final deployment. He trained that dog. He trusted him with one thing, his daughter. Judge Everly read aloud. If anything happens to me, Axel is to be returned to my family. He knows what loyalty means. He knows what Wren means. There was quiet again. Then a woman stood from the media row. She wore desert boots and a press badge. Mila Torres. I was embedded with Sergeant Callahan's unit. I have footage you need to see. The screen flickered. Dust, chaos, gunfire. A body dragged from flame and ruin by a dog with Axel's eyes. Bloodied, determined, alive. I was there, Mila said softly. He didn't just remember, he saved. The judge didn't speak for a long while. She let the silence stretch until it filled the room like breath held too long. I see no threat here. I see history. I see loyalty. Axel stays with Wren Callahan. This court is adjourned. The applause didn't burst. It built like sunrise breaking frost. Helen pressed her hand to her mouth. Rachel's shoulders sagged in relief. And Wren? Wren didn't cry. She leaned forward and rested her forehead against Axel's, whispering something only he would ever hear. Outside, the reporters surged, but the girl and the dog walked quietly through them toward home. Justice, for once, had remembered what it meant to listen. Maple Hollow's spring thaw came slowly, like a town learning to breathe again. Snowdrifts shrank into puddles that soaked into the thirsty earth, and daffodils split the soil in bursts of gold and green. But it wasn't just the land that was waking. It was Wren Callahan. Ever since the ruling, Wren had barely left Axel's side. The German shepherd, once feared and caged, now trotted beside her through muddy yards and dusty community halls with a grace that belied the weight of his history. People no longer avoided the dog. They watched him, admired him. Some even brought their children close, just to see if the stories were true. It started with a question, whispered by a teacher to Dr. Eliza Monroe. "Do you think that dog could help my son?" The boy, 8-year-old Levi, hadn't spoken since his father's accident. He flinched at sounds, bolted from crowds. Nothing worked. Until Axel lay beside him, silent and steady, and Levi's fingers crept toward his fur like reaching for the edge of a memory. The boy didn't speak that day, but he smiled, and for his mother, that was enough to believe. From that moment, Axel was no longer just Wren's protector. He became a purpose. Wren and Dr. Monroe called it Axel's Circle. Not a clinic, not a program, a circle, a safe place where scars didn't have to hide. They started small, hosting weekly sessions in the old school gym. Axel greeted each child the same way, with calm eyes, a gentle nudge, and time. Lots of time. It wasn't therapy in the clinical sense. It was connection, stitched from fur and silence. There was Emma, who once screamed in her sleep so violently her foster parents feared letting her rest alone. With Axel, she fell asleep on the mat beside him, curled up like a question mark, slowly straightening into peace. There was Tyler, whose stutter came from watching his little sister get hit by a car. He wouldn't talk to people, but he would whisper to Axel about birds, about school, about the way his sister's laugh used to sound. Then came Javier, a boy who had survived a school fire. He hadn't drawn or painted in months. During his first visit, he stared at Axel for 10 minutes, then picked up a crayon and began sketching the dog's silhouette. By his third visit, he had drawn an entire comic about a dog who protected a town from monsters. Word spread. Volunteers signed up. Donations arrived, some anonymous, others with notes that simply said, "Thank you." Even the county council, once wary, began referring children to the program. Rachel Boone joined full-time, leaving behind the sterile halls of her vet clinic to work with the dog that reminded her what healing really looked like. And then there was Asher Kemp. The same boy who once stood beside Zane Thatcher at the cage's edge. Watching Wren with doubt in his eyes now showed up every Saturday before dawn. He didn't talk much, just swept the floors, laid out the blankets, and restocked the snack baskets with awkward, teenage precision. He watched Wren from a distance, always waiting for her to push him away. She never did. One morning, after a session where Axel had calmed a sobbing toddler with nothing but his steady breath, Asher lingered. Wren was brushing Axel's coat, her back to him. "I didn't mean for it to go that far," Asher said, voice dry like winter branches. "We thought she'd run, scream. I didn't know he'd care." Wren didn't turn around, but her hand never paused. "He trusted me," she said softly. "And you gave me the chance to prove he could." They never talked about it again, but from that day on, Axel rested his chin on Asher's boot like he belonged there too. Journalists returned, this time not to pry, but to listen. They filmed quietly. A PBS crew spent 2 days capturing the rhythm of Axel's Circle. Children laughing, adults crying, a girl and a dog who had no words but all the understanding in the world. The footage aired nationally, and when it did, it reached the eyes of someone unexpected. A week later, Wren received a letter from Hastings University, signed by the Dean of Youth Social Initiatives. They had seen the segment. They had read the testimonials. They wanted to offer her a full scholarship, any program, any major, her choice, whenever she was ready. No applications, no essays. Just one condition. Keep doing what she was already doing. Helen wept when she read it. Not out of pride, but out of something older and deeper, relief. That the pain they had carried hadn't been for nothing. That Matthew's memory had planted something that now bore fruit. That night, Wren sat by the barn where Axel slept. She ran her fingers over the chain-link gate that once held him back, now repurposed as the entrance to the circle. She whispered, "We're not finished." Axel lifted his head, eyes catching the moonlight. He didn't wag his tail, didn't move. He didn't have to. They both knew it was true. The next chapter wasn't about what had been taken, but what was being built. Together. And in the stillness of Maple Hollow, the kind of stillness that only comes after a storm, the promise of Axel's circle spread like morning sun across the frost-cracked fields, warming everything it touched. Spring settled gently over Maple Hollow, wrapping the town in tender greens and sun-warmed soil. The frostbitten earth softened under the promise of new beginnings, and for the first time in years, the air around the Callahan farmhouse didn't carry the weight of waiting. It hummed with something else. Hope. Wren stood at the edge of the garden, the hem of her jeans muddy, boots damp with morning dew. Axel sat beside her, head high, breath slow. A quiet sentinel watching the day begin. His ears flicked as a distant tractor rumbled to life, but his gaze never left Wren. She held the letter again, the one bearing the gold seal of Veterans with Honor. They wanted to expand Axel's circle, turn it into a national model, beginning with pilot programs in 3 states. They wanted her to help lead the charge. A girl and her dog. A story that had become a blueprint for healing. Helen had barely spoken when Wren showed her, just held the page in trembling hands and whispered, "Your father would have said yes, without blinking." But Wren wasn't sure. Not because of fear, but because of how deeply the circle had rooted itself in the soil of Maple Hollow. This place wasn't just where Axel had been found. It was where they both had been rebuilt. Could she take that somewhere else? Multiply it without thinning its soul? Those questions clung to her as she walked the perimeter of the field, the new training area for therapy dogs freshly marked with flags. Volunteers bustled around, some raking soil, others assembling fencing. The community had shown up again, just like they did after the trial. But this time, it wasn't to defend, it was to build. Even Asher was there, hauling bales of hay like they weighed nothing, his hoodie streaked with dust. He paused to wave at Wren, and she returned it with a nod. He'd come far, from accomplice to anchor, and it made her think of how grief didn't just break. Sometimes it carved new paths. That afternoon, a box arrived with no return address. Inside was a check folded into thirds, unsigned, but accompanied by a note scribbled in slanted cursive. For the circle. I didn't know how else to say, "I'm sorry." The name wasn't needed. Wren tucked the note into her journal beside a dried daffodil she'd pressed weeks ago. Some wounds healed in silence, but the voice that mattered most came back in a different form. Wren was preparing Axel's dinner when Helen called her inside. "You have a call," she said, holding out the landline. "It's from New York." Wren pressed the receiver to her ear, cautious. "Hello?" The woman on the other end introduced herself as a producer for a national broadcast. They had read her article, "The Last Command My Father Gave," and wanted to air it during their Memorial Day special. It would be read by an actor, professionally narrated, and paired with footage of Axel's circle. They promised dignity. They promised respect. Wren said yes. When the segment aired, neighbors gathered at the feed store, watching through the dusty window on the shop's old TV. Wren's words echoed across the country. "He's not just a dog. He's the last command my father gave me, and I intend to obey." Letters flooded in, from veterans, from single parents, from children who had been quiet too long. Rachel Boone started pinning them to the walls of the training barn until there was no more space. Then they started tacking them to the ceiling. On the last Sunday of May, a ribbon-cutting ceremony was held for the newly built Axel's Circle Community Pavilion. Kids ran between folding chairs and the snack table, balloons caught in the wind, volunteers adjusting microphone cords. Wren wore her father's dog tag around her neck, the metal now burnished from years of her thumb brushing its edges. She stood on the small wooden stage, Axel at her side, and tried to speak. Her mouth was dry. Her hands shook. But Axel nudged her knee. She took a breath. "I thought I'd lost him," she began, her voice quiet but steady. "When my dad didn't come home, I thought all of him had been buried with that folded flag. But what I learned, what Axel reminded me, is that love leaves instructions, even when the voice is gone." She paused, looking around the crowd, catching the eyes of a veteran with a cane, a mother holding her daughter's hand, a boy gripping the edge of his chair so tightly his knuckles were white. My father's last command wasn't written. It was lived, through Axel, through this. She gestured behind her to the banner fluttering gently in the breeze. Axel's Circle, where memory becomes purpose. The applause didn't come all at once. It came like a sunrise, slow, warm, growing. Wren smiled, wiping her cheeks with the sleeve of her jacket. Axel barked once, low and proud. Later that evening, Wren sat with Helen on the porch swing. The sky above Maple Hollow stretched in streaks of lavender and tangerine. Fireflies danced. Somewhere, a fiddle played faintly on someone's radio. Axel lay at their feet, one ear flicking lazily at a mosquito. Wren reached down and stroked his fur, eyes on the horizon. "We're ready," she said. Helen didn't ask what she meant, just reached over and squeezed her hand. Somewhere deep in the yard, the wind passed through the dogwood trees. The promise held. Because some dogs don't just remember commands, they remember love. And love never retires.